Right. Well, that's what I've been trying to say for the last 20 minutes, right? It's that I think we need to open up to psychological modes of explanation, but bring a more rigorous philosophical examination to those forms of explanation. And I think we have to accept that the instrumentation for the study of consciousness is consciousness itself. So we have to cultivate our own consciousness so it gives us more information about the world around us, and that we have to learn these new logics, the logic of distance in the transphysical worlds. So all of these are modes of studying consciousness. And that's the whole purpose. I mean, the point is that our current scientific language doesn't even give us the concept of consciousness, right? It's just we can't even explain it.
Well, it's in there, but there's an attempt to eliminate it, eliminate the act of the observer.
That's right.
You know, and so it is in there.
Well, it's
There's
in there.
Recognition.
It's in there only in quantum theory, but in the rest of the sciences, it's not even there. In physics, until quantum theory, physics had no room in it for consciousness whatsoever. It considered the entire physical universe to be a causally closed domain in which consciousness had no causal effects whatsoever. In other words, atoms influenced atoms, but consciousness didn't do anything to atoms in the old way of thinking. Right? Now, with quantum theory, the whole thing is quite different. Most other scientists haven't caught up to quantum theorists in terms of understanding the importance of consciousness in the real world. Am I answering your question, or am I missing something?
Kind of. I'm thinking a little bit more practical. You know, for instance, the work that we're involved with, looking at how collective consciousness may influence a community for crime reduction or improving the quality of life. How do you apply the scientific method in that area where the very thing that you're applying as an intervention is consciousness?
Well, the point is, scientific method itself needs to be completely reformulated.
That's what I'm suggesting. How does what you're saying here, at a practical level, inform how that formulation might take?
Yeah, well,
Formulation.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of work to be done to get this to be more practical. But in general, what I can say is that it allows us to consider causal interactions among high-grade actualities. In other words, we in this new way of understanding reality, we can make room for empathic and telepathic interactions. And we can also make room for the way in which higher-grade actualities can influence the aims of lower-grade actualities. Now, both of those ideas are directly applicable to what you're studying. But then how do we operationalize that, right? How do we determine what constitutes the evidence for these things? These are the questions that I'm inviting us all to work on together. Right? I can now see that we can metaphysically articulate these things. Okay, we can now intelligently talk about how we're all empathically creating a field together, and that our aims influence each other in certain ways. Now, how do we operationalize that? Right? How do we look for it? Right? These are the questions. You're actively working on those questions, and I'd like to work with you on that and see what we can do. Right? But we are operating at the very beginning of this science. You know, Francis Bacon hadn't discovered the mathematical method. He was just saying, let's look at things and get the patterns by being empirical. Right? It took 100 years for scientific method to be fully developed. We're at that stage, right? I'm just saying, hey, let's start asking the question that you're asking. The ideas that I'm presenting allow us to ask your question in a much more focused way. And then we have to see if we can actually get results out of that. That's the work that remains to be done.
Paradoxically, more focused and more holistic at the same time.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
That's what seems to be lacking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems to me the question in the transpersonal, in the transmaterial world, the question of distance is more a question of intensity than actual distance.
Intensity is part of it, but it's also resonance of some kind. Right? But then how do we, so, you know, Rupert Sheldrake has introduced this idea of morphic resonance. That idea seems to have some important explanatory power. but still it's very vague,
Yeah.
right? So he'll say, well, all small streams are morphically resonant with each other. And so what happens in one small stream area will affect all the others. But that's very vague. How do we define morphic resonance? You know, what's the difference between a small stream and a big river? Are they morphically resonant? Right? So we don't have a logic for this. We need it. You know, people don't realize how mysterious logic is. People don't realize how language is formed. Language and logic are both formed. So what happens is there's some area of our life, and that area of our life will occasion the feeling of confusion. And so we begin to devote a lot of attention to what confuses us. And as we do that, there's a process through which logical distinctions begin to occur in our minds. And then we apply those logical distinctions and they seem to work. It's this murky thing, you know. When I started out the work I've been doing and asking this question, where are the subtle worlds, I had no clue how to even address it. And I just thought about it day after day and month after month. And as I did, gradually, I thought this distinction and that distinction. I began to come up with conceptual distinctions that organized the territory. So I can now present these ideas to you, which is the result of, 10 or 15 years of work. But there's so much more work to be done. So for example, here's this idea of morphic resonance. Let's stay with that because it's more well known. It's a really powerful idea. It has explanatory power, but we have very little understanding of how to work with it. If we pay attention to it and discuss it with each other and really bring our attention there, gradually language and logic will emerge into consciousness, which makes us better able to deal with it. It's a long-term process. It's the process through which language is created. And language is what creates our shared sense of being in the same world. So we're trying to create a new world, a new linguistic domain, a new cognitive domain for ourselves. This is what the great rishis used to do, right? And we are functioning as rishis, as civilization creators. Right? We are creating a new human life world. And so what I'm doing here is I'm trying to rough it out. Here's a sketch of the new reality. Now, if this sketch appeals to you, if you begin to use these ideas to explain your experience to yourself, then you'll begin to find these questions coming up. And if you dwell on those questions with enough loving concentration, you will find yourself discovering new ways of dividing experience up into categories. And those will become new language. And as you share that language with us and we begin to speak it, our reality will begin to change. This is the task in which we are involved. And we're at a very early stage of it. Right? So these questions you're asking are fantastic. I'm so glad you're asking these questions. It's the purpose of these lectures to inspire those questions and to get you working on it, right? So that we can all work together to form the new human life world of the new mutation of consciousness into which we're moving.
I'm just thinking of, in terms of like the possibilities of it being dangerous.
Yes.
But then that makes me think about more conversations about good and evil. Like right now that it's so limiting, like that's bad, so we can't talk about it or think about it or experiment with it. And so as you're talking about language, I'm thinking about, I know it's more visual than my words are giving me right now, but...
What's the picture?
Well, just that there's good and there's evil
Right.
and there's two solid things
Right.
and that they need to be talked about and merged into more pieces so there's
That's
more
right.
to work with.
Exactly. And that's partly the development of language, right? So good and evil is a very crude conceptual distinction, but we might discover 32 varieties of good and 17 varieties of bad, and then we might realize that there's crossover, and then under certain circumstances, 10 of the bad categories are actually good, and 13 of the good categories are actually bad, and so like right, that's development of language and discrimination. The famous saying is that Eskimos have 32 words for snow because they really pay attention to it.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do. We need to bring our attention to these things. And it's scary and dangerous because civilization, in some important sense, is founded on conceptual distinctions. Human civilization is founded on conceptual distinctions. For example, there are class distinctions, which are very important to the maintenance of civilization. And then there is the male-female divide, and the male role and the female role. And people who are really locked into that discrimination freak out around homosexuals because homosexuals blur the distinction between males and females. And a lot of people we know are freaked out by anything which blurs the distinction between good and bad. Right? So we are entering into a very murky territory. As Brian Swim says, our civilization is without a story. The old story, the old sets of conceptual discriminations that ordered the human life world have ceased to be adequate, and we're in no man's land. And so we're venturing out into no man's land with the purpose of creating a new life world with a new set of conceptual discriminations which can order a new civilization. That's the work in which we're engaged. And it takes exactly what you're talking about. Breaking down the old distinctions and remaking them in a new and more subtle and more interesting way so we can move forward in our evolution. Josephine?
You talk about these disembodied entities that are troublemakers
Yes.
or evil.
Yes.
Where does that concept come from? How can you explain it? Why do you think they're evil entities or troublemakers? Because we're talking about, okay, some of these disembodied entities are people that have died, okay? And we mentioned before that as people maybe go into the vital and then the mental world, all these traps of our environment, of culture, whatever kind of, all the bad stuff that you drop them and get into the essence of your being. So where is this evil interest coming from?
Yeah.